The morning arrived over Chicago in a thin gray drizzle, the kind that turned glass towers into shadows and made the sidewalks shine like strips of dark ribbon. Traffic muttered low and impatiently along North Michigan Avenue. Shoes splashed through shallow puddles. Umbrellas opened and tilted and disappeared into the rush of people who had somewhere urgent to be. Matthew Hale stood still inside all that motion as if he had long ago stepped out of the race. The rest of the city was running. He was 34, broad-shouldered but a little leaner than he used to be, like life had slowly taken small pieces from him and he had chosen not to ask for them back. His hands were the first thing people noticed when they bothered to notice him at all. Scarred across the palms, rough at the fingers, marked by grease that never seemed to leave no matter how often he scrubbed. He wore a faded navy jacket over a plain gray shirt, jeans with a careful repair at one knee, and boots that had been resoled twice. In his left hand he held the hand of his daughter. Bonnie was 7, small for her age, with bright serious eyes that always seemed to be studying the world as though it had hidden meanings adults had forgotten. She wore a red baseball cap 2 sizes too large that kept slipping over one eyebrow, and tucked beneath her arm was a stuffed bear named Turbo. Turbo was brown once, though time had softened him into no particular color. One button eye was missing. The other sat slightly crooked. His belly had been repaired with mismatched thread in blue and white, each stitch sewn by Matthew's clumsy, determined hands. Bonnie squeezed his fingers. "The clouds ever get tired, Daddy?" Matthew glanced up at the sky. "Arguably, from carrying all that rain, and maybe they cry it out so they can feel lighter." Bonnie considered this with the solemnity of a philosopher. "That makes sense." They stood with a cluster of commuters beneath the bus stop shelter while the city hurried around them. Matthew checked the time on a watch that had once belonged to his wife. The leather strap had cracked years ago, and he had glued it twice instead of replacing it. He could afford a new one, maybe, but some things stopped being objects after enough time. Some things became proof. He had savings left. Not much, if he measured every grocery trip, delayed every bill that could be delayed, and kept saying no to everything that wasn't necessary. He had maybe 4 months. 5 if nothing went wrong, but things always went wrong. 3 years had passed since Claire died, and the world had divided neatly in two, before and after. Before, Matthew had worn tailored shirts and stood in conference rooms explaining failure probabilities to executives who nodded like they understood what risk really meant. Before, his name had circulated in engineering circles with a quiet kind of respect. Before, he had worked in propulsion risk analysis and systems architecture, solving problems other people couldn't even describe clearly. After, none of that mattered. After, Bonnie needed someone to walk her to school. Someone to wait when class ended. Someone to know that Wednesdays were art day and Fridays were library day and thunderstorms made her quiet instead of scared. Someone had to remember that she hated bananas unless they were sliced into cereal and that she only slept well if Turbo was tucked beneath her right arm. Matthew had stepped out of the life he built because the only person he couldn't afford to fail was 7 years old and holding his hand. He no longer dressed like success. He no longer spoke like someone trying to impress. He had become almost invisible to the kind of world that only measured worth in shine. A few feet away, a woman stood very still, and even without looking directly at her, Matthew sensed the disturbance around her. People gave her space without realizing they were doing it. She wore a black fitted jacket, tailored trousers, and shoes so clean they seemed untouched by the rain. Her dark hair was pulled back in a way that suggested every strand had been negotiated into place. She had the unmistakable aura of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves when she entered. But today something was wrong. She kept glancing toward the street, then toward the bus, then briefly down at a phone that was nothing more than a dead rectangle in her hand. Her face was composed, but the composure was too deliberate. Her eyes moved too quickly. Bonnie leaned toward Matthew and whispered, "That lady looks like she forgot how mornings work." Matthew almost laughed. He looked at the woman again. There it was, not arrogant. Panic, carefully folded into posture. He took one slow step closer. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" The woman turned. For 1 second her eyes landed on his face, then dropped automatically to his jacket, his boots, his hands. It wasn't cruelty exactly, it was habit. A whole life of being taught how to sort people in one glance. Then embarrassment crossed her features. She said, and for the first time her voice didn't match the image. It was lower, thinner, more human. More human. I don't have the fare. Matthew waited. Amy car broke down 3 blocks away, she added, as if the explanation itself sounded ridiculous to her. My phone is dead. I don't carry cash. She let out the faintest breath. I know how that sounds. Bonnie looked up at her, like a grown-up problem. The woman blinked, and something in her expression softened. Matthew reached into his pocket. He felt the folded bills there, the ones he had put aside for Bonnie's afternoon treat. A hot chocolate made, or one of those bakery cookies with too much frosting Bonnie always chose because they looked cheerful. He didn't hesitate. He pulled out $5 and held it toward the woman. It's just a bus ride, he said. Nobody should be left standing in the rain. She stared at the money like it was something stranger than charity, like it was trust, and trust was harder to accept. I can pay you back, she said quickly. I'm heading to Voss Tower. I have a meeting. A very important one. She almost seemed angry at herself for sounding desperate. If you give me your name. Go, Matthew said quietly. Oh, the bus is here. The bus pulled up with a hiss of wet brakes. Doors folded open. She still hadn't taken the money. Matthew gently pressed the bills into her hand. Clouds don't stay in one place, he said, adjusting Bonnie's slipping cap. Neither should you. For the first time the woman truly looked at him. Not his clothes, not his shoes, him. There was something unsettling in being seen by a stranger at the exact moment you no longer had your armor. Thank you, she said. Bonnie gave a small wave. Don't miss your important thing, Miss Girl. The woman's mouth curved into the faintest smile. I'll do my best. Then she stepped onto the bus and disappeared into its dim interior, carrying $5 wrinkled from a man who had less than most people at that stop, and more than almost all of them. Matthew watched the bus pull away, then looked down at Bonnie. No cookie today, bug. Bonnie shrugged as if it had never mattered. Oh, that's okay. Turbo says heroes skip snacks sometimes. Matthew glanced at the bear. Turbo talks a lot for a guy with one eye, only to smart people. He nodded gravely. Good. I'd hate to be left out. They started walking. The rain eased by late morning, though the sky remained the color of old steel. Matthew held Bonnie's hand as they made their way toward downtown. He couldn't afford a sitter, and the school had a half-day schedule because of staff training, so Bonnie came with him. She didn't complain. She never did. Children who lose someone early often learn how to make themselves easier to carry. That fact broke him in ways he never showed. On the train ride, Bonnie sat pressed against his side, drawing in a small spiral notebook. Matthew reviewed interview notes from memory because the paper copy had gone soft from being folded too many times. Voss Capital Group. Mid-level technical systems role, though the description was vague enough to suggest either a real job or a trap designed by people who didn't understand what they were asking for. This would be interview number 14 in 8 months. 14 polished smiles. 14 versions of a "we'll be in touch." 14 rooms where people scanned his resume, admired it politely, then stared too long at the employment gap and the current contract work, and the fact that genius in worn boots makes corporate people uncomfortable. He had once been excellent in rooms built for excellence. Now he entered them carrying lunch money calculations in his head. Bonnie held up her notebook. Look. He looked. She had drawn 2 figures beneath a huge yellow sun. One was tall with square shoulders. The other had a red cap and a stuffed bear. The sun took up almost half the page. It's us, she said. It's very sunny. I know, she said. Because I don't like drawing sad weather all the time. He swallowed past something hard in his throat. That seems wise. When they stepped into the lobby of Voss Capital Group, Matthew felt the familiar shift in atmosphere. Not because anyone knew him, but because everyone knew immediately that he did not belong. The lobby stretched upward in polished stone and blue-tinted glass. It was the kind of space designed to make ordinary people speak more quietly. Security desks gleamed. Soft music hummed somewhere unseen. Men and women in dark clothing crossed the floor with the kind of efficient indifference that passed for importance. 63 applicants waited in the seating area. Every one of them looked prepared for a magazine photo about modern ambition. Tailored suits, sharp shoes, perfect posture, expensive watches. Their smiles were tight, competitive rehearsals. Then Matthew walked in with Bonnie, her red cap, and Turbo the one-eyed bear. The laughter wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. A man near the reception desk glanced over his glasses and said to no one in particular, Did the daycare merger go through without telling us? Bonnie leaned closer to Matthew's leg. Matthew crouched and retied one of her shoelaces, though it didn't need tying. Sometimes dignity looked like refusing to stand up too fast. When he rose, he said nothing. He only met the speaker's gaze for a moment with a silence so complete, it made the man look away first. A senior coordinator approached, smiling in the cold professional way of people who weaponize politeness. Sir, interviews are for applicants only. I am the applicant. The coordinator's eyes dropped to Bonnie. And the child? My daughter. I'm afraid. You're afraid of a quiet child with a stuffed bear? The coordinator stiffened. A few nearby applicants pretended not to listen. Matthew reached into his pocket and handed over the printed email confirmation. If policy requires rescheduling, I understand. But I'd appreciate hearing that from whoever wrote this invitation. The coordinator glanced at the paper, then at his tablet, then back at Matthew with visible reluctance. Please wait. Bonnie sat on a low stool near the window. She opened her notebook again and resumed drawing as if high-rise lobbies and human cruelty were minor weather events. Matthew sat beside her. Are there giants in this building? She whispered. Us people. Sometimes that's the same thing. He looked at her. Your mother used to say things like that. Bonnie kept drawing. I remember her voice a little. Matthew went still. What do you remember? He asked gently. Bonnie frowned in concentration. Soft. And laughing when she was tired. And laughing when she was tired. And that song about the moon with holes in it. He had to look away then, out through the vast lobby windows where the city blurred silver with rain. Yes, he said after a moment. That sounds right. Minutes later, the coordinator returned looking unsettled. Mr. Hale, she said. The interview has been moved. Matthew took the news with the numb calm of a man well practiced in disappointment. A move to another day? No, moved upstairs. How far upstairs? She swallowed. 38th floor. The elevator ride took less than a minute and felt longer than the last 3 years. Bonnie stood tucked against him, holding Turbo. The mirrored walls reflected them from every angle. The worn jacket, the little girl, the child's bear, the polished discomfort of the coordinator beside them. Matthew caught his own reflection and barely recognized the man he had become, not because he was lesser, but because grief and love had remade him into someone with no spare energy for performance. The doors opened onto a private executive corridor, lined with abstract art and silence. They were led to a conference room with walls of glass and a view of the city spread far below like circuitry. Inside sat 7 people. At the head of the long table was the woman from the bus stop. Now there was no mistaking who she was. The room aligned around her the way compasses aligned to north. Her jacket had been replaced by a charcoal blazer. Her phone was charged, her posture immaculate, her expression composed. Yet the instant her eyes met Matthew's, the composure changed. Not broken, deep. Beside her sat a man in his 50s with silver at the temples and a face sharpened by years of getting his way. His suit fit like entitlement. His smile contained no warmth at all. The coordinator cleared her throat. Mr. Matthew Hale. The silver-haired man flipped open a file. The woman at the head of the table did not answer right away. She was still looking at Matthew. Then she said, yes. The coordinator withdrew and closed the door. Bonnie stayed near the wall, clutching Turbo and watching everything with alert childlike silence. The silver-haired man leaned back. Richard Dane, he said. Director of Strategic Systems Oversight. Matthew nodded once. Richard looked at the file again and laughed under his breath. Interesting. A man with an incomplete recent work history, no current corporate affiliation, and a child in an executive meeting. Matthew remained standing. Would you prefer I leave? Richard smiled. Depends. Are you planning to explain why a sidewalk mechanic applied for a senior systems architecture role? Eleanor Voss finally spoke. Richard. The single word carried warning, but Richard ignored it. Matthew set his worn folder on the table. I'm here because the role description references a systems failure pattern your company doesn't fully understand. And you do? Yes, Richard steepled his finger. According to your resume, you once worked in propulsion risk analysis and acoustic diagnostics. Mid-tier positions. Nothing that suggests. I wrote the original failure loop methodology behind the adaptive diagnostic system your firm currently licenses through 3 shell subsidiaries. The room stilled. Richard's smile sharpened. That system is registered under my division. Our registration and authorship are not the same thing. Bonnie quietly climbed into a chair near the wall, swinging her legs once then stilling them when Matthew glanced over. Turbo sat upright beside her like a witness. Eleanor's gaze moved from Matthew's face to his hands. The same hands that had held out $5 to her in the rain. Richard tapped the file. If you're implying some kind of intellectual theft, this is neither the venue nor the audience for amateur drama. Matthew turned his head slightly toward the whiteboard mounted on the far wall. May I? Richard smirked. Please. I'm dying to be entertained. Matthew walked to the board, took a marker, and began to draw. No notes, no slides, no pause to think. A sensor branch, a control relay, feedback path, delay compensation logic, redundancy trap, acoustic anomaly threshold. He wrote equations in compact clean handwriting. Not rushed, not showy, only precise. The diagram unfolded across the whiteboard with the unmistakable confidence of someone not remembering information, but returning to a place he had once lived. Two executives leaned forward. One whispered, "That's impossible." Richard stopped smiling. Matthew stepped aside. Your current version fails in humid environments because the feedback damping was altered to reduce cost overhead. It creates a false confidence interval and hides the noise signature until it cascades. You've had near-loss events, 6 in the last 18 months. 2 were mislabeled as vendor error. Silence. An older woman at the far end of the table spoke for the first time. How would you know that? Because the original design included a manual acoustic cross-check at the exact point your revised system removed it. Richard stood abruptly. This is speculation. No, Matthew said. This is memory. Eleanor rose from her chair and walked to the whiteboard. She studied the diagram, then looked at Richard. Did you alter the damping thresholds? Richard's jaw tightened. We optimized them, without author review. The company owned the framework. Matthew said nothing. Eleanor turned to him. Who are you? For a moment the room disappeared from Matthew's face. What remained was older than disappointment and quieter than anger. I'm the man who built a machine that could hear trouble before it became disaster, he said. Then I watched people who didn't understand it turn it into a trophy. Richard scoffed. You were one analyst on a larger team. Matthew met his eyes. Forward and redraw it. And redraw it. Richard didn't move. One of the executives cleared his throat. Another lowered his gaze to the table. Bonnie, from her chair, whispered to Turbo. Audie does this when grown-ups forget things. No one laughed. Eleanor turned back to the table. Want internal audit, compliance review and original development files pulled before noon. Richard snapped. On whose authority? Eleanor looked at him with absolute stillness. Mine, the word landed like a lock. Richard's face changed then, not to outrage but to fear. It was the fear of a man who suddenly realized the story around him had stopped obeying him. You can't make operational decisions based on one theatrical performance from a disgruntled former employee. Eleanor's gaze did not leave him. You can make them based on years of ignored instability, a visible mismatch in authorship competence, and the fact that the only person in this room who understood the architecture drew it from memory in under 4 minutes. No one moved. Then slowly he did. He set the badge down with more force than necessary. The sound echoed. You're making a mistake. Eleanor folded her hands. No, I think I'm correcting one. Richard looked at Matthew as though hatred alone could restore the old order. Then he walked out without another word. The door shut behind him. For several seconds no one spoke. Then Bonnie raised her hand. Every adult in the room turned toward her. Yes, Eleanor said, and to her own surprise her voice gentled. Can Turbo have walked? A few people let out startled breaths that were almost laughter. The tension cracked. Eleanor pressed a button on the table phone. Can someone bring a glass of water, please? And perhaps something for a child. Bonnie looked at Matthew. And maybe not fancy crackers. Too crumbly. Eleanor almost smiled. The formal meeting dissolved after that, though not complete. Executives clustered around the whiteboard. Questions came quickly now but with a different tone. The cautious respect people reserve for competence when they can no longer pretend not to see it. Matthew answered with economy. He did not perform. He did not boast. Every sentence made the room more aware of how much it had overlooked. When the others finally stepped out to begin the audit storm Eleanor had triggered, only she, Matthew and Bonnie remained. A tray had arrived. Water, juice, fruit, small sandwiches. Bonnie accepted them as if boardrooms routinely surrendered lunch under pressure. Eleanor stood near the window, looking at the city below. You knew who I was the moment you walked in. Matthew sat beside Bonnie while she peeled the crust from a sandwich. I knew when I saw everyone else in the room defer to you. And this morning, you were a woman in the rain without bus fare. Eleanor turned. Most people would have recognized me. Most people are looking for different things than I am. She absorbed that. I owe you an apology, she said. At the bus stop. I judged you in the first second. Matthew nodded once. Most people do. And you still helped me. He looked at Bonnie, who was carefully sharing half a grape with Turbo. My daughter was watching. Eleanor followed his gaze. Something in her face loosened. Does she always come first? Yes. Even before work? There is no work worth doing that asks me to fail her. The simplicity of that sentence seemed to land harder on Eleanor than any accusation could have. She sat across from him. For the first time since morning, the CEO vanished enough for the woman beneath her to speak plainly. I built this company by never appearing weak, she said. By learning rooms fast. By making decisions before doubt could catch up. I thought that was strength. She glanced down at the table. Then I stood at a bus stop with a dead phone and no cash and discovered I had built a life with no margin for being human. Matthew didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, knowing who will still be there when things fail. The room went quiet in a different way then. Bonnie swallowed a bite of sandwich and looked at Eleanor with open curiosity. Do you have kids? The question was so direct, so innocent, that Eleanor actually looked startled. Then unexpectedly, she laughed. A soft, brief laugh touched with something dangerously close to grief. I usually keep working, she said. Bonnie frowned. That sounds lonely. Eleanor looked at Matthew. She's observant. She gets that from her mother. The words came out gently but Eleanor saw the shadow that followed them. I'm sorry, she said. Matthew gave the smallest shrug. It happened 3 years ago. Sorry doesn't fix it. No, Eleanor said quietly, it doesn't. By early afternoon the internal review had already produced enough evidence to confirm Matthew's claims. Eleanor's assistant briefed her twice in 10 minutes. Richard Dane had indeed shifted credit, buried warnings, and structured reporting lines to isolate the people most likely to challenge him. Matthew had not simply been overlooked. He had been made invisible because his competence threatened a more convenient lie. The realization made Eleanor physically cold. She found Matthew and Bonnie outside in the loading area behind the building, where concrete met wet wind, and the city sounded farther away. They sat on a shipping platform with paper bags of vending machine lunch and looked, in that moment, more peaceful than anyone inside the tower. Bonnie was feeding tiny bread pieces to imaginary birds. Turbo watched from her lap. Matthew looked up when Eleanor approached but he didn't stand. He had nothing to prove here. I thought you'd left, she said. My interview seemed over. It isn't. She held out a folder. Matthew took it but didn't open it. I'm offering you the position of Director of Technical Risk, Eleanor said. A full authority to review architecture stability across divisions. Flexible schedule. Remote work where possible. School day accommodation built into the contract. Wednesdays protected. Matthew looked at her. Wednesdays? You mentioned art class. He said nothing. I'm not making this offer because of the bus, she continued. I'm making it because I nearly lost the clearest voice in my company before I even knew it was there. I don't want to run a place that rewards polish and punishes substance. Bonnie tilted her head. What substance? Matthew answered without looking away from Eleanor. The part that's still there when the shiny bits fall off. Bonnie nodded. Like Turbo. Exactly like Turbo. Eleanor waited. Matthew finally opened the folder. The salary was more than he expected, enough to stop counting grocery items in his head, enough to breathe, but he didn't smile. Eleanor noticed. What is it? He closed the folder again. Good offer can still cost too much. What would it cost? My daughter knowing I chose a building over. Eleanor considered that for a long moment. Then don't. Matthew's eyes narrowed slightly. The job, she said. Not the old bargain. I'm not asking for your life. I'm asking for your mind. I've had plenty of executives who gave me their nights and weekends. Most of them weren't worth half an hour of your clarity. Wind moved lightly across the loading dock. Far below, a truck reversed with a warning beep. Bonnie leaned toward Eleanor and studied her face with childlike seriousness. You have sad eyes, Bonnie whispered. Eleanor seemed caught off guard. Bonnie nodded. But I think you're good. Something flickered across Eleanor's face, then yours face, then some expression too private to name. She crouched so she was at Bonnie's level. "Oh, thank you," she said. Bonnie held out Turbo. "You can hold him if you want. Just support his back because he's been through a lot." Eleanor accepted the bear like something sacred. Matthew watched the exchange, and for the first time that day, let himself imagine the possibility that this turn in the road might not be another dead end. "What happens if I say yes?" he asked. Eleanor stood still, holding Turbo carefully. "Then tomorrow, we begin fixing what should have been protected. And tonight, you go home knowing the next month won't be built out of fear." Saw Bonnie asleep in a chair too small for grief. Saw unopened bills. Saw 14 interviews. Saw $5 leaving his hand that morning without calculation. Dignity, he had learned, was not something the world awarded. It was something you carried yourself quietly, even when no one saluted it. He looked at Bonnie. "Oh, what do you think, Bug?" Bonnie finished arranging the last breadcrumb. "I think if you help the broken machine people, maybe they'll stop being weird." Eleanor laughed again, this time for real. Matthew exhaled through his nose. "That is strong strategic reasoning." Bonnie nodded. "I know," he signed. The days that followed did not become easy all at once, because real life rarely transforms in a single dramatic sweep. Debt did not evaporate overnight. Grief did not dissolve because a contract had been signed. Bonnie still had hard evenings when she missed her mother so much she went silent for hours. Matthew still woke some mornings with the old weight already waiting on his chest. But the ground beneath them changed. At Voss Capital, Matthew became the quiet center of a storm long overdue. He rebuilt reporting chains, reinstated safeguards, asked uncomfortable questions in calm tones that made evasion nearly impossible. People who had once dismissed him now listened with notebooks open. He still wore the same navy jacket for the first week until Bonnie insisted he needed at least one fancy-ish coat for his important engineer boss work. Eleanor, for her part, changed in smaller ways that were visible only if you knew where to look. She began carrying cash. She charged her phone, yes, but no longer trusted technology as if it were a personality trait. She asked more questions before making decisions. She spent less time performing certainty and more time noticing who in the room had gone unheard. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, she passed Matthew's office and found Bonnie at a small desk in the corner drawing solar-powered dragons or impossible bridges, while waiting for art class pickup time. Once she stopped and asked Bonnie what she was making. "Machine that listens before things break," Bonnie said. Eleanor stood very still at that. One Wednesday evening, months later, Eleanor found a small envelope on her desk. Inside was $5 folded neatly, and a note in Matthew's plain handwriting. "You never paid back your bus fare." For the first time in years, Eleanor cried in a room no one else was in. She kept the note. Because some debts are tiny in money and enormous in meaning, and some mornings that begin in rain become the dividing line between the life you were performing and the life you were meant to build. Matthew never became loud about what happened. He never told the story like a victory. If people praised him, he redirected it. If they called him extraordinary, he shrugged. He still packed Bonnie's lunches, still showed up early for school events, still patched Turbo when the old bear threatened to come apart again, still believed that the truest measure of any day was whether his daughter felt safe in it. Years later, when people inside the company spoke about the period that saved Voss Capital from an internal collapse of its own making, they often mentioned the audit, the restructuring, the strategic recovery. But quietly, person to person, they told another version. They told of a man in a faded jacket at a rainy bus stop, a man who had every reason to harden and somehow did not. A man who gave away his daughter's treat money to help a stranger and asked for nothing in return. A man so secure in his own dignity that he no longer needed the world to announce it. And of a little girl in a red cap, holding a one-eyed bear together with mismatched thread, who somehow saw more clearly than a room full of executives. Because the truth is, the most important people are often the easiest to overlook. They are not always polished. They are not always loud. They do not always arrive with titles or timing or the right kind of shoes. Sometimes they are standing quietly in the rain, holding a child's hand, carrying worlds no one else can see. Sometimes greatness looks like sacrifice with no audience. Sometimes genius looks like patience. Sometimes wealth looks like kindness, And sometimes the person holding everything together is the one everyone forgot to look at. Matthew knew that long before anyone else did. He knew his dignity wasn't something the world had given him, so it wasn't something the world could take away. He knew love was not measured in speeches, but in school pickups, repaired toys, skipped treats, tied shoelaces, and the 1,000 invisible choices that keep a child's heart intact. He knew the loudest proof of character is often silence under pressure. And he knew, more than anything, that to one little girl with a red cap and a wounded bear, he had always been enough. If you want, I can also turn this into an even more polished YouTube-ready 30-minute narration version with stronger emotional hooks, retention moments, and a more viral storytelling flow while still keeping no headings.